I work in a municipal archive, the kind of place people imagine as quiet and harmless. Rows of metal shelves, dust that never fully settles, the soft hum of scanners running late into the evening. My job is simple. Digitize old city maps before the paper finishes crumbling. Most of them blur together after a while. Same grids, same faded ink, same handwritten notes in the margins. I stopped expecting surprises years ago. That's why I noticed the map immediately. It wasn't cataloged properly. No inventory number, no date, no author stamp. It was slipped between two verified plans from the 1940s, as if someone had been careful enough to hide it where it wouldn't stand out, but careless enough to leave it at all. The paper felt right. Thick, yellowed, brittle at the edges. The ink matched the period perfectly. If I'd seen it alone, I would have assumed it was authentic without question. The problem was the city itself. It had a name I didn't recognize. Not unfamiliar, just wrong, like a word translated twice and never corrected. The streets were laid out with unsettling precision. Residential zones, narrow service roads, a central square. Everything made sense. Too much sense. I checked our database. Nothing. I checked national registries, historical atlases, even obscure regional records we kept on microfilm. Still nothing. A city that detailed doesn't simply vanish. Fires leave records. Wars leave scars. Even abandoned settlements leave paperwork behind. This one left nothing. I told myself it was a fictional draft, maybe a proposed development that never happened. That explanation should have ended my curiosity. It didn't. As I scanned it, I noticed something else. Certain street names felt close. Not identical, but similar to districts I passed every day on my way home. Familiar syllables rearranged, like echoes. I zoomed in on one street in particular. The curve of it matched a road near my apartment almost perfectly. Same bend, same intersection angle. Even the spacing between buildings looked right. I pulled up a modern map on my screen and aligned them side by side. The overlap wasn't exact, but it was close enough to make my stomach tighten. Cities evolve. Streets get renamed. But this felt less like history and more like imitation. I logged the map as unverified and placed it back in its folder. Before shutting down for the night, I glanced at it one last time. For the first time, I noticed that the street matching my neighborhood wasn't just similar. It was already there. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Cities often repeat patterns. Streets curve the same way, squares are symmetrical, neighborhoods echo each other. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. Then I saw the news. A young man had gone missing in my city. The report was brief. Last seen on Oakview Lane. My pulse quickened. Oakview Lane was the street that had caught my attention on the map. I laughed nervously at my own imagination. Coincidence, I told myself, just coincidence. But when I flipped open the map again, my stomach sank. Oakview Lane was on it. Not just a name, its position matched exactly where the street lay in reality. Curiosity overtook caution. I began comparing old missing person reports with the streets on the map. I couldn't believe what I found. Every recent disappearance seemed to have a street on the map corresponding to it. Sometimes the name matched loosely, sometimes only the placement was precise, but the correlation was too strong to ignore. And then the map changed. At first, I thought I was imagining it. One day, I swore a small residential block appeared that hadn't been there before. A cluster of tiny houses, unnamed, along a dead-end street. I hadn't noticed it in yesterday's scan. I ran through every backup file. The block didn't exist there before. I emailed a colleague, sending the scans for verification. She replied quickly, "Looks normal, nothing unusual here." A week later, she vanished. The report called it an accidental fall in a remote area. I didn't believe it. Every time I looked at the map, more streets appeared. More blocks. More intersections that corresponded with missing people I hadn't even considered until their names appeared in the morning news. It was like the city was righting itself, responding to the real world. By the end of the week, the block near my apartment, the one that matched Oakview Lane, had expanded on the map. Houses multiplied, alleys split off, a small square emerged. And I realized something terrible. If this map was growing, there was no telling how far it could reach. I put the map aside, telling myself I'd focus on my work. But at night, when the office was silent and the scanners hummed softly, I swore I could see the streets shift under the scanner light, as if alive. And I knew, without doubt, that the coincidences were no longer random. By the third week, I stopped pretending the map was harmless. Every day brought more anomalies. Streets that had been blank yesterday were now lined with tiny rectangles, houses, garages, alleyways, drawn with unnerving precision. The more I studied it, the more it felt like the city was alive, a breathing entity that existed somewhere just beyond our perception. I began keeping a log of every new street and block that appeared. I cross-referenced them with missing person reports. The pattern was undeniable. Each new disappearance corresponded to a new section on the map, appearing almost immediately afterward. It was as if the city consumed people to grow itself. I told no one. No one would believe me. Anyone who glanced at the map casually would see only a faded sheet of paper with streets and squares. Nothing threatening, nothing unusual. Then there was the first time I noticed signs of resistance. A man disappeared from a neighborhood 2 blocks from my apartment. When the police arrived, the scene was chaotic. Furniture overturned, a window broken, footprints smeared with blood. The official report was terse. Accidental fall during domestic incident. No one mentioned the bloodstains. No one mentioned the scream neighbors swore they heard. I stared at the map, and there it was. A new alleyway had appeared, right in the location where the struggle had occurred. The shapes of the houses aligned perfectly with the overturned furniture. Someone or something was marking the events, recording them like entries in a ledger. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, imagining the streets on the map shifting, stretching, expanding. I started noticing familiar places subtly changing in reality. A mailbox that wasn't there before, a streetlight moved slightly, an unfamiliar hedge along a sidewalk. Small things, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me question whether my city was stable at all. One night, I returned to the office after hours. I wanted to trace the newest additions. The scanner hummed quietly, casting a sterile light across the desk. When I placed the map under it, I noticed something new, a small square entirely blank near the center of the expanding city. No name, no buildings, just a void. My heart thumped. I realized with a chill that the void corresponded to the general area of my apartment. I backed away from the desk. The hum of the scanner seemed louder now, almost impatient. I shut down the lights and left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the map was no longer just a record of the missing. It was preparing for me. And somewhere deep in my mind, a thought I couldn't ignore whispered. If the city grows by consuming people, what happens when it reaches me? I hadn't yet answered that question. But I knew with an instinctual certainty that I was about to find out. I tried to destroy it. The map sat on my desk like a challenge, and for days I fought the urge to look at it. Finally, late one night, I grabbed a lighter and touched the edge of the paper. The flames curled, blackened the corner, but when I pulled it from the fire, the lines were visible again. Faint, smudged, but unmistakably there. I tried shredding it. I cut every square inch with scissors, turned the pieces into confetti, but when I collected the scraps in a box, the street outlines were still visible, as if pressed into the fibers themselves. I panicked. I considered giving it away, passing it to someone else. I printed high-resolution scans and emailed them to a colleague, hoping distance would prevent the city from reaching me. 3 days later, I received a terse reply. Everything looks normal, no anomalies. Then the building caught fire. Not a small fire, a gas leak, they said. People were hospitalized. One coworker was critically injured. I later learned that the only items completely untouched were my digital scans, which had vanished from the email server overnight. I realized the city wasn't just on the paper. It was everywhere I had touched it. It followed the map, not the physical form. And that blank square in the center, the one corresponding to my apartment, had grown. It was no longer small. It stretched across half a neighborhood now, empty space surrounded by streets and blocks that had appeared in the last week. I could feel it, even without looking at the map, like a cold absence pressing against reality. I tried logic. If I stopped engaging with the map, maybe it would stop growing. I stopped going to the archive, stopped scanning, even avoided reading the news for days. But every morning, new sections appeared in my memory, as if the city were writing itself in my mind now. The quiet escalated to something worse. In the street outside my apartment, lights flickered in sequences that mimicked the new alleys on the map. A stray cat ran across the pavement exactly where a small lane had appeared. Footsteps echoed above me in apartments that had been empty for years. And then I noticed the first direct marker of presence. A figure appeared on the map. Not a house, not a street, just a small, dark icon, crudely human-shaped, standing in the blank square. I froze. It wasn't labeled. There was no name, no date, but I recognized the stance. It was leaning slightly forward, observing, waiting. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't ignore it. The city had moved beyond being a passive observer. It was aware. It was preparing, and I had no idea how to stop it. I could only watch as the blank square expanded further, swallowing the familiar streets around it. The city was coming for me, and every precaution I'd tried had failed. For the first time, I truly understood. There was no outside. There was only the map and what it was growing into. By now, I had stopped thinking of the map as paper. It was an extension of the city itself, a living record, and I was painfully aware that it knew I was watching. Every day, new streets and buildings appeared without explanation, and every disappearance reported in the news corresponded to these additions. I felt trapped, as if the map's growth dictated reality itself. One evening, I returned home from the grocery store and noticed something subtle but wrong. The row of hedges along my street was uneven, though I remembered trimming them carefully last week. A streetlight that should have been across the corner now flickered near my front gate. I told myself I was imagining it, stress, paranoia, but the feeling of being watched refused to dissipate. At night, I sat with the map again. I compared my neighborhood carefully, square by square. That blank area in the center, the one representing my apartment, had grown. More importantly, tiny dark marks had appeared. Not houses, not streets, just small dots. At first, I thought they were ink stains, mistakes. But they were positioned precisely where doors, windows, and hallways should be, like schematic markers. Then I noticed movement. I swear I did. A dot shifted slightly each time I blinked, repositioning itself along the blank area's perimeter. I stopped breathing. My hand hovered over the map, unwilling to touch it yet unable to look away. Days later, as I walked through my neighborhood, I realized the changes weren't limited to paper. Mailboxes had appeared that weren't there before. A narrow alley that should have been a simple grassy divider had been paved with concrete, exactly like a small street on the map. Neighbors casually mentioned seeing unfamiliar people in the area, but when I approached them, the strangers vanished. Their footprints remained briefly, pressed into the damp soil, before fading. One night, I heard footsteps in the building above me, even though the apartment had been empty for years. I called the landlord the next day. He swore no one lived there. The hairs on my neck stood on end as I realized the city, or something it controlled, was no longer passive. It was testing me, probing the limits of my space. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe I was losing my mind. But the marks on the map told me otherwise. They were growing more defined, more deliberate each day. And then, for the first time, I noticed a street labeled with a name that chilled me to the bone. It was almost identical to mine. Not quite, but enough that my brain recognized it instantly. The street wound through the blank area like a spiral, converging toward a tiny dot at its center. I stared at the map for hours, tracing the lines with trembling fingers. That dot, the crude human icon, had moved closer to the center. Its stance was deliberate now, leaning forward, its gaze impossible to escape even on paper. It was waiting, and I knew with a sick certainty that waiting meant I was next. The city was no longer just expanding. It had found me. The realization didn't come all at once. It settled slowly, like a truth my mind had been circling for weeks but refusing to name. The map wasn't predicting disappearances. It wasn't reacting to them either. It was accounting for them. I forced myself to go back through old cases, ones that predated my discovery by decades. Cold files, forgotten names. As I compared them to the oldest visible layers of the city on the map, a pattern emerged that made my hands shake. The earliest streets matched the earliest missing persons. The city hadn't appeared overnight. It had been growing patiently, methodically for a very long time. People didn't die. They were reassigned. That explained the lack of bodies, the vague police reports, the accidents that never quite made sense. In the rare cases where violence was mentioned, it was brief. Signs of struggle, overturned furniture, a smear of blood. Resistance, nothing more. After that, the trail always ended, because there was nowhere else to look. The city existed alongside ours, layered over it, feeding on it. Every new resident gave it more structure, more streets, more space to expand. And the map was its interface, the only way to perceive the process from the outside. I stopped sleeping entirely. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw streets unfolding, houses aligning themselves into neat rows. I began to recognize the logic of it, the terrible elegance. The blank central square wasn't empty because it was unfinished. It was reserved. When I looked again, I saw that the spiral street bearing my almost name was complete. At its center stood a small square building I didn't recognize. Yet when I walked through my neighborhood the next morning, I noticed construction fencing where there had been none before. No signs, no workers, just a structure rising quietly, efficiently. That night, the map changed again. The human icon, mine, I understood now, was no longer at the edge. It stood at the threshold of the central square. The lines around it were darker, more confident. This wasn't observation anymore. It was scheduling. I understood then why destruction hadn't worked. Why passing the map to someone else had only caused harm. The city didn't care who held the record. It only cared that someone did. Someone had to witness the transfer to maintain continuity. And now that role was ending for me. I packed my apartment, though I didn't know why. I avoided mirrors. I avoided windows. The footsteps above me grew louder each night, closer, until they stopped directly over my bed. On the map, my figure stood still. Waiting wasn't passive. Waiting was the final step. And the city was ready to take me in. By the 7th week, I had come to accept a truth I could neither deny nor escape. The map was not a record of the past, and it was not predicting the future. It was a living ledger, a mechanism for the city's continued expansion, and I was its next entry. Every day, the streets, alleys, and buildings that appeared seemed to pulse with intention. They weren't random. They were selective, deliberate, and the final spiral leading to the blank square was meant for me. I didn't know if anyone would believe me if I told them. Friends would assume paranoia. Police would dismiss it as delusion. The press would write it off as coincidence. Yet the signs were everywhere. Minor alterations in my neighborhood, footsteps in abandoned apartments, lights flickering in impossible patterns, stray cats moving along streets that didn't exist hours before. It all pointed to the same conclusion. I was visible to the city, and it was preparing for me. That night, I returned to the archive one last time. I brought the original map, unscathed despite everything I had tried to do. The room was silent, save for the hum of the scanner. I placed the paper beneath it, and the edges curled slightly as though greeting me. The blank square in the center had grown again, larger than ever, with the dark icon at its heart. The crude figure representing me, now fully defined, upright, waiting. I traced the spiral street with my finger. It led directly to that central square. My reflection in the glass of the scanner appeared pale and hollow, and for the first time, I saw what I truly was, a node in the city's design, not an observer. I wasn't meant to resist. I was a component. I tried to leave, but the door refused to budge. I twisted the handle again and again. The air felt heavier, thicker, like it had weight. I realized then that the building itself was part of the system. Every corner, every wall, every floor aligned with the map. I was trapped inside the ledger. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost meaning. When I looked back at the map, the streets around the central square had shifted subtly, closing in, narrowing the spiral. The small dark icon, me, leaned forward, moving slowly toward the center. I felt the same motion inside my chest, a pull, a vertigo of inevitability. I understood what the city demanded. I had to step into it, become part of the structure for it to continue. Resistance was futile. Destruction of the map had failed. Distance had failed. Observation alone had failed. I began walking toward the center of my apartment. Every step felt heavier, as if the floor itself resisted me. When I reached the spot corresponding to the central square on the map, the space shimmered ever so slightly, like heat rising from asphalt. The edges of the room blurred. I could see, in my peripheral vision, the streets from the map unfurling in 3 dimensions, twisting around me, pressing in, enclosing me in geometry that made no sense. A sudden sound stopped me, a soft scratching coming from all directions at once. Footsteps, perhaps, or something else moving along lines I could not perceive. The icon on the map mirrored my hesitation, bending slightly at the knees. I exhaled, a mist of fear and acceptance, and stepped forward. The moment I moved, the world tilted. The walls of my apartment dissolved into streets, alleys, and buildings from the map. Air became solid, pavement became liquid, and I felt my body being rewritten into the city's structure. It wasn't painful, not in the conventional sense, but utterly complete. Every thought, every memory, every cell aligned with the design, catalogued, absorbed. Then the map was empty again. The spiral street remained, the houses and alleys intact. But the central square, the blank square, was just that, blank. My icon had vanished. The next day, someone else would open the archive, someone else would notice the map. A new square would appear, a new spiral would be drawn, and the city would continue. Somewhere faintly, I could feel it watching, waiting, always hungry for the next witness. The ledger would grow, and perhaps one day it would reach them, and the city would never stop. If you felt the tension creeping in, hit like and subscribe for more stories that blur the line between reality and horror. Leave a comment with what part unsettled you the most. I read every one.